This is one of the most daunting rites of passage for any home cook. French macarons have been at the forefront of my bucket list items ever since I got interested in cooking. They're just so simple and so classic, but everyone knows the challenge they present to anyone who's not experienced, which would be me. However, I love all forms of cooking, including baking, and I figured now was the time to finally try to climb this mountain. So that being said, I didn't try to come up with my own recipe or experiment, I just wanted to follow something verbatim. But on that note, a lot of the recipes that I saw were almost identical in ingredients and in technique. Seems like macarons are not a very forgiving recipe and you kinda have to follow a standard. But I like how the Preppy Kitchen explains his recipes, especially his baking ones, so I decided to follow his instructions. So I'll link his video below if you want to try to follow the recipe. I won't be listing the ingredients here. Also, I use a kitchen scale here for all my measurements due to the precision that a recipe like macarons requires. And my food processor doesn't really sit right on top of my kitchen scale, so I have to put it on top of a paper plate first. But I started by combining the almond flour and the powdered sugar inside of the processor, and I gave that a few pulses to try to break down the chunks and combine everything. And then I grabbed 2 bowls and a sieve and I tried to press this through to really remove all the chunks. Towards the end, I was just kind of pressing everything through with my fingers, and then I just redid this into another bowl just to really remove the rest of the chunks. I don't know if I should have discarded the specks that weren't naturally falling through on their own. I was pressing them through with my hands, but there was quite a bit left and I didn't want to waste it, so that's what I thought the best solution was. Then it was time to make my meringue, and I started by weighing out my egg whites. I had these egg whites left over from using the yolks to make the French buttercream, which I also got from the Preppy Kitchen, and I released that video last week. But just for that reason, between the yolks and the whites, I think that the French buttercream and the French macaron recipes go together perfectly. I added my cream of tartar and began to whip this on high speed until it got foamy, and then it was time to slowly spoon in my granulated sugar. I then gave this a few minutes to whip up until it developed soft peaks. This was where I added my vanilla extract and some food coloring. I said this in my buttercream video, I don't have gel food coloring, I just have liquid food coloring, which people say is of a lesser quality, but I already have it in my possession, so I'm not going to go buy some more just to waste what I already have. I just compensated by adding a little bit more than a couple drops. Then I returned to whipping this on high speed until I got to stiff peaks. It was probably 7 or 8 minutes of whipping in total to get to this point, and I just love my KitchenAid, I just have to say that. Then it came time for the macaronnage. Yeah, I took a couple years of French in high school, what about it? Yeah, this is the process of combining our dry ingredients into the meringue very carefully. Also, this wasn't in the recipe, but I added a pinch of salt to the dry ingredients. I just thought it would need it. So if this is ruined later, then it's not the Preppy Kitchen's fault, it's mine. So in roughly 3 equal stages, I dumped the dry ingredients into the meringue and cut and folded them together carefully with a spatula. I'm absolutely not an expert at this, but I was just trying to skim around the edges and then cut through the middle until everything was incorporated. And then I just repeated with the other 2 portions of the dry ingredients. After several minutes of mixing and my arm getting sore, I think I finally got everything together. But then the next stage is to try to push the air bubbles out and try to make this a really smooth mixture. I spent several more minutes doing this and just trying to make sure that I wasn't over mixing it, but I definitely didn't want to under mix it either. And here I began seeing that the almond flour was leaving these grainy pieces throughout the batter, and that made me worry that I should have tossed those chunks that I had in the top of the sieve instead of pushing them through. But I pressed on. After a few minutes I got this to be pretty smooth, I think. I don't know how it was supposed to look, but this is where I stopped. Then I grabbed my small round piping tip and added that to my piping bag and used the glass to scoop all the batter in. Then I grabbed some sheet trays and used some non-stick spray to stick some parchment paper on top of them. Is that not an oxymoron? And to me, this was the scariest part of the entire process. I am so bad with piping bags and I'm never steady with using them, and I don't know how much pressure to use. I'm just not good at it. But regardless, I started to try to pipe out my rounds, trying my hardest to keep constant pressure on the bag throughout, and then trying my best to make my circles even, and then twisting that tip around at the top to break it off. My first few were definitely not pretty, but as I started going, I started to feel like I got the hang of it and got pretty even circles. However, about halfway through my first tray, I started to notice that my circles were spreading into each other. And the problem was, even though I tried to fix it at this point, I had already piped out a bunch of circles that were going to spread into each other over time. That little delay before they actually spread into each other cost me a few circles because I had piped a few after before I noticed it. I started to freak out. I didn't really know what to do because I didn't think I could really just separate them because of how delicate they are and they're really liquid at this point. So I just tried to finish my circles and spread them apart nicely, especially on the second sheet. But overall, it was like half of my circles that were touching each other, which kind of sucked. It did feel cool that I piped out exactly 40 cookies, which would leave me with 20 sandwiches, a nice even number. And one last step was to smash these trays on the counter a few times to knock out any air bubbles. I did try to see if I could separate the fused ones with a metal spatula, but that wasn't really doing anything. So all in all, I just decided to deal with this and move on. I let these rest on the counter for about an hour to dry out, and after they dried out, I did try to separate them one more time, but it still wasn't working, so I just gave up. But now it was time to throw them into the oven and let them bake. Things were looking good and they were developing the feet on the bottom that I was looking for, and I rotated their positions halfway through, and after about 13 minutes they looked done, so I pulled them out. At this point I started to have a little more optimism because the ones that baked into each other seemed like they were going to be able to pull apart after they cooled down. But that's what I did. I let them set for about 45 minutes to cool completely. I put them on a wire rack at some point to let the air circulate around them as well. These cookie shells weren't perfect by any means, but I don't think they looked too shabby for my first time. Yeah, some of them were like oval shaped and they weren't all equally sized, and some of them looked lopsided and some had cracks in it, but I pictured them looking a lot worse. So what I did next was try to match the cookies in pairs. I looked to put them with a similar sized cookie so that the sandwich would be about even. And yeah, I had to break apart the ones that were stuck together, and they were very delicate. I had to be super careful because if I pulled too much on one side, it would kind of rip part of the other cookie off. But I just tried not to have two ugly cookies together, just at least so I had one nice cookie to put on top for presentation. And the last order of business was to fill these, and like I said, I made the Preppy Kitchen's French buttercream for this, which I already had in the fridge from the day before, so I pulled that out a little while earlier to let it start coming to room temperature, and then I just brought it back to life in my stand mixer to give it a nice texture again. I used the same round tip in another piping bag and then put all this into the piping bag. And again, I'm not an expert at piping bags, this is one of my worst talents to be honest. But I just tried to put a nice spiral in each cookie so I could fill the whole surface. At first I was kind of being conservative because this was a lower amount of buttercream, but I ended up having plenty, which was great. I definitely didn't get the nice smooth outside of the cream on most of the cookies, so they weren't going to be picture perfect, but I kind of assumed that anyway. But each time I just topped off the cookie with the other half and put all these on my cake holder. And yeah, that was it. I was pretty proud of how these came out despite all the mistakes I made earlier and all the scares that I had. I think the liquid food coloring did a pretty good job. These don't look too bad with the color, although there is some browning on the bottom which kind of gives it a little discoloration, but oh well. With how delicate this whole process is, I'm pretty sure this could have gone a lot worse, so I'm happy. The last step is the hardest one. It's to put this in the fridge to rest for 24 hours before I eat them. People say you can eat them right away, but they always say it's better after a day or two. But here's me on the next day trying these out. The vanilla milk is back. So we finally arrived. It's been almost 24 hours, so it's time to try these. In that time, the cookie has kind of softened up around the side, which is expected because it's spent a night in the fridge. They were a little crispier yesterday, but I think this is how they're supposed to be eaten anyway. What does it taste like?
Creamy, vanilla-y goodness.
Is it sweet?
Extremely.
But not too sweet.
You can never go too sweet on these.
What about the texture of the cookie? Is it like fluffy, I guess, or not too dense? I don't use all that.
Not too dense, it's like crisp on the outside. Yeah, slight crisp on the outside, nice and chewy on the inside.
But it's been long enough, let's jump right in. Wow. My question is, how did someone come up with this process? How did this happen? Like, how did someone look at a bag of almonds and say, let's grind this up into a powder and mix it with sugar and make these amazing, delectable cookies with it? I'm kind of at a loss for words. I really love sweets, and this is one of the best things that I've ever had. Man. Above all, it's the texture of this sandwich. The cookie has just a great chew to it, and then the creamy buttercream in the middle. I don't know, I didn't make these perfectly, but I think I did a plenty good enough job to make these passable. And I think I'm glad I put the salt in the dry mixture because I feel like it makes the cookie taste a little better. The recipe didn't have any salt in the cookie itself, so but this is definitely a special treat, and there's a reason that this is worth all the meticulousness and time that it takes to make it. So am I motivated to put all this work in again and try this again? Absolutely, 100%. I think there's sometimes I walk away from a recipe just not wanting to go through all that again, namely like the 3-day lasagna that I made from Adam Ragusia. But I think I'm walking away from this one motivated to try different flavors and to better my technique itself. This was just a fun process. It's not overly hard and it doesn't take an enormous amount of time. It's just the steps are so exact and you have to follow them precisely to make this work. But as usual with these videos, I'm pretty much showing you how I'm learning to do things in the kitchen. Not always exactly trying to teach you something, but the little kicker at the end is I hope that I can motivate someone, show you that a regular person like me can do something like this. You know, sometimes you might be watching the professionals do a video like in the Preppy Kitchen's video and feel like you can't do that and it's above your skill set and stuff like that. But hopefully I can show you that someone without experience and without much knowledge can make something like this work. But if you do like to watch these videos and you find some entertainment or sometimes education from it, then I really appreciate your time. Let me know what else you'd like to see. I'm still figuring out my niche and figuring out what kind of videos I want to make. I really just like everything at this point and don't want to confine myself to one specific genre of food or genre of cooking. But let me know what you'd like to see from me and I'll continue working on it. As always, thank you for watching, be blessed, and I'll see y'all next time. Amazing.